September 1940. A 28-year-old physicist walks into a room filled with Britain's most decorated generals and says 5 words that make them laugh out loud. Hitler is bending radio waves. They think he's insane. One admiral actually walks out. Another suggests he be removed from his position immediately. But this young man has evidence that terrifies him. Evidence that suggests German bombers can strike any target in Britain with perfect accuracy, even in total darkness, even through the thickest fog, even when British fighters fill the skies. He has discovered something impossible. Something that breaks every known law of radio propagation. Something that could end the war before Christmas, with German victory certain. The military gives him 72 hours to prove his impossible theory. If he fails, he'll be dismissed as a crackpot. If he succeeds, he'll have to do something even harder. Stop an invisible weapon that nobody believed could exist. This is the story of how one man's refusal to accept impossible saved Britain from annihilation, exposed the greatest secret of the Nazi war machine, and changed the nature of warfare forever. This is the story of the invisible war that raged above Britain while the nation slept below, unaware that their survival depended on battles fought with mathematics, radio waves, and one physicist's unshakable conviction that he was right and everyone else was wrong. The date was September 3, 1939. Britain had been at war with Germany for exactly 12 hours. While most of the nation was still processing what this meant, still wondering if German bombers would appear over London at any moment, still rushing to evacuation points and air raid shelters, Dr. Reginald Victor Jones was sitting in an office that didn't officially exist, reading a document that made his hands shake. Jones was not an imposing figure, thin, bespectacled, with the perpetually rumpled appearance of someone who spent more time with equations than with other people. He looked more like a distracted university lecturer than someone who would become one of the most important figures in the war effort. At 28 years old, he had been plucked from academic obscurity just 6 weeks earlier by the British Intelligence Service, given a desk in a converted storage room in the Air Ministry building, and told to investigate scientific developments of military significance in Germany. Nobody had really explained what that meant. Nobody seemed to think it was particularly important. Jones suspected he'd been given a make-work job, something to keep him out of the way while real intelligence officers did real intelligence work. He had no secretary, no staff, no budget to speak of, just a desk, a telephone, and a growing stack of files that other departments had dumped on him because they didn't know what else to do with them. The file he was reading now had been passed to him with a note that said simply, "Technical. Probably nothing. File appropriately." It was a signals intercept, captured by British listening posts from German military radio traffic in the final days before war was declared. Most of it was routine. Coded messages about troop movements, supply requisitions, the bureaucratic machinery of war mobilization. But buried in the middle was something else. A transmission that had been flagged by the intercept operator with a question mark. The German message referenced something called Knickebein. The word meant crooked leg in German. The context suggested it was some kind of navigation system. The message gave coordinates, radio frequencies, and what appeared to be performance specifications. Jones read it once, then again, then a third time, more slowly, his physics training automatically processing the numbers. The specifications were impossible. According to the intercept, Knickebein was a radio beam system that could guide aircraft to targets with accuracy measured in hundreds of meters, not kilometers. It could work at ranges of several hundred miles. It used frequencies in the range of 30 megahertz, and it could maintain beam coherence despite the curvature of the Earth, despite atmospheric interference, despite everything that every radio engineer knew should make such a system impossible. Jones sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. His first instinct was that the intercept must be wrong, perhaps a decoding error, Perhaps a deliberate piece of German disinformation meant to confuse British intelligence. Perhaps just a technical discussion that had been misunderstood. But something about it nagged at him. The level of detail was too specific to be completely fabricated. The frequencies mentioned were in a range that could theoretically propagate long distances. And most tellingly, the message had been transmitted on a military frequency using what appeared to be operational coding, not the kind of security that would be used for deliberate disinformation. Jones pulled out a pad of paper and began working through the physics. Radio waves at 30 megahertz would have a wavelength of about 10 meters. To create a focused beam, you would need an antenna array with dimensions on the order of several wavelengths. That was achievable. The real problem was maintaining beam integrity over long distances. Radio waves, like light, tend to spread out as they travel. A beam that's narrow at the transmitter becomes wider and wider with distance, until at hundreds of miles it would be so diffuse as to be useless for precision navigation. This was basic physics, the kind of thing Jones had taught to undergraduate students before the war. You couldn't defeat the inverse square law just by wishing it away. But what if the Germans had found a way around it? What if they'd developed some new antenna design, some clever modulation technique, some breakthrough in radio engineering that allowed them to do what should be impossible? Jones spent the next 6 hours working through calculations, filling page after page with equations, exploring different theoretical approaches. By midnight, he had convinced himself of two things. First, creating a precision radio beam navigation system was theoretically possible, though it would require engineering at the absolute cutting edge of what was achievable. Second, if the Germans had actually built such a system, it would represent a revolution in strategic bombing capability. The implications were staggering. Britain's primary defense against German bombers was darkness. Night fighters existed but were primitive, relying on luck and searchlights to find their targets. Anti-aircraft guns were largely ineffective at night. The assumption was that German bombers, like British ones, could only bomb accurately in daylight when they could actually see their targets. This made them vulnerable to fighters and anti-aircraft fire, which limited when and where they could attack. But if German bombers could navigate precisely at night using radio beams, that entire defensive calculus collapsed. They could attack any target, any time, in any weather, with accuracy approaching daylight bombing. And there would be almost nothing Britain could do to stop them. Jones looked at his calculations again, hoping to find an error, some reason to dismiss this possibility. He found none. The physics worked. The engineering was difficult but achievable. And if anyone could do it, it would be the Germans, whose radio technology had been consistently ahead of Britain's throughout the 1930s. At 2 a.m., Jones did something that would have gotten most junior intelligence analysts fired. He picked up his phone and asked to be connected to the home of Professor Frederick Lindemann, Winston, Churchill's personal scientific advisor, and one of the most influential men in British scientific circles. The conversation that followed would change the course of the war. Professor Frederick Lindemann, known universally as the Prof, was not a man easily impressed or easily awakened. When his telephone rang at 2:15 in the morning on September 4, 1939, his first instinct was to ignore it. When it continued ringing, his second instinct was to answer it and deliver a withering rebuke to whoever was disturbing him. But something in the urgency of the young voice on the other end made him pause. "Professor Lindemann, my name is Dr. Reginald Jones. I'm with Air Intelligence. I apologize for the hour, but I've discovered something that I believe requires immediate attention at the highest levels. I need 15 minutes of your time. Tonight, if possible." Lindemann's initial irritation began to shift toward curiosity. The young man sounded genuinely frightened, not just excited or self-important. And he had used the word discovered, not learned or been told. That suggested direct analysis, not just passed-along gossip. "Dr. Jones, I don't know you. Why should I believe this is worth losing sleep over?" Jones took a breath. "Because, sir, I have evidence suggesting the Germans have developed a radio beam navigation system that violates what we think we know about radio propagation. If I'm right, they can bomb any target in Britain with precision at night. If I'm wrong, I'm a fool and you can go back to sleep. But if there's even a chance I'm right, every hour we delay could cost thousands of lives. There was a long pause on the line. Then, you have physics training? Oxford, sir. Balliol College. I studied under Professor Lindemann. Another pause. I don't remember you. I was unremarkable, sir. But I understand radio theory, and I understand what I'm reading in these intercepts. Please, 15 minutes. Lindemann made a decision that would prove to be one of the most consequential of the war. My club, 1 hour. If you're wasting my time, Dr. Jones, I'll see to it that you're counting rivets on destroyer hulls for the duration of this war. Jones arrived at the exclusive club with his stack of papers and calculations. Lindemann was waiting in a private room, looking skeptical and irritated. For the next 90 minutes, Jones presented his analysis. He showed the intercepted German transmission. He explained the physics of radio beam navigation. He demonstrated why it was theoretically possible despite seeming impossible. And he made his case for why Britain needed to take this threat seriously immediately. Lindemann listened without interrupting, his sharp mind following Jones's technical arguments. When Jones finished, Lindemann sat back and lit his pipe, studying the young physicist through the smoke. "You understand," Lindemann said slowly, "that what you're suggesting contradicts the advice we've received from every radio expert in the country. The Air Ministry's technical staff says precision radio beam navigation is impossible at these ranges. The BBC's engineers say it can't work. Even the Royal Navy's radar specialists say you're chasing ghosts. I know, sir, but they're wrong. The physics works. I've checked it repeatedly. Why should I believe you over them?" Jones met his eyes. "Because they're thinking about radio beams the way we use them for broadcasting. Wide coverage, omnidirectional. But the Germans aren't broadcasting. They're creating something more like a radio lighthouse, but infinitely more precise. It's a completely different engineering problem, and they've apparently solved it." Lindemann stood and paced, puffing his pipe. "If you're right, Dr. Jones, this is the most important intelligence discovery of the war so far. If you're wrong, you'll cause panic and waste resources we desperately need elsewhere. The stakes couldn't be higher." "I know, sir." "Then you also know that I'm going to have to report this directly to Churchill. He'll want to act on it immediately if he believes it. Can you stake your reputation and possibly your career on this analysis?" Jones didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir. I can." Lindemann made his decision. "I'll arrange a meeting with the air staff for tomorrow morning. But Jones, understand this. They will try to tear your analysis apart. They will question your credentials, your data, your methods, everything. The burden of proof is entirely on you. And, if you can't convince them, this entire matter gets buried and we never speak of it again." "I understand, sir. Thank you for listening." As Jones left the club, Lindemann returned to the private room and sat for a long time, thinking. The young physicist had been persuasive, frighteningly so, but the implications of his theory were so dramatic that accepting them would require upending Britain's entire approach to air defense. The institutional resistance would be enormous. Lindemann picked up the telephone and made a call that went directly to 10 Downing Street, to Winston Churchill's private line. Churchill was still First Lord of the Admiralty at this point, not yet Prime Minister, but already one of the most powerful voices in the government. "Winston, it's Lindemann. I apologize for the hour. I've just had a most disturbing conversation with a young physicist from Air Intelligence. I think you need to hear about this personally." The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. on September 5th in one of the Air Ministry's secure conference rooms. Jones arrived 30 minutes early, his arms full of documents, charts, and calculations. He'd been up all night refining his presentation, anticipating objections, preparing responses to every criticism he could imagine. The room slowly filled with some of the most senior figures in British military and scientific circles. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, commander of RAF Fighter Command. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory. Professor Henry Tizard, chairman of the Aeronautical Research Committee and one of Britain's most respected scientists. Representatives from the Admiralty, the War Office, the BBC's Engineering Department, and, to Jones's shock, Winston Churchill himself, who slipped in quietly just before the meeting began and took a seat in the back. Jones felt his stomach knot. He'd expected to brief mid-level staff officers, perhaps a senior air marshal at most. Instead, he was about to present to the leadership of Britain's war effort. If he failed to convince them, the matter wouldn't just be buried. It would be discredited so thoroughly that even if evidence piled up later, it would be dismissed as the same nonsense that crazy young physicist had pushed. Air Marshal Dowding called the meeting to order. "Gentlemen, we've been told that Dr. Jones has discovered intelligence of potentially critical importance. Dr. Jones, you have the floor. I suggest you make your case clearly and concisely. We're all extremely busy." Jones stood, and for just a moment his nerve failed him. These were men who commanded thousands of aircraft, who made life-and-death decisions daily, who had forgotten more about warfare than he would ever know. What made him think he could convince them of something that contradicted everything their experts had told them? Then he remembered what was at stake. He thought about the cities full of people who would die if he was right, and said nothing. He thought about the war that might be lost, because one junior analyst was too intimidated to speak up. He began, "Gentlemen, 6 days ago, British signals intelligence intercepted a German military transmission that references a navigation system called Knickebein, meaning crooked leg. The transmission included technical specifications that initially seemed impossible, but I've analyzed them carefully, and I believe they describe a radio beam navigation system capable of guiding German bombers to targets anywhere in Britain with accuracy measured in hundreds of meters, regardless of weather, darkness, or visibility." There was immediate skepticism in the room. Jones could see it in the body language, the exchanged glances, the barely suppressed sighs. But he pressed on. "I know this seems impossible. Every radio engineer will tell you that radio beams spread out over distance, that the curvature of the Earth limits their range, that atmospheric conditions make precision impossible. But the Germans have apparently found solutions to these problems." He began drawing diagrams on the blackboard, explaining the physics of directional antennas, of beam focusing, of how careful frequency selection could exploit atmospheric propagation characteristics. He showed his calculations demonstrating that a sufficiently powerful transmitter with a properly designed antenna array could create a beam narrow enough to be useful for navigation, at ranges of several hundred miles. Then he presented the intercepted German transmission, walking through each technical detail, showing how the specifications described a system that was just barely within the boundaries of achievable engineering. The German transmission mentions frequencies around 30 megahertz. This is crucial. At these frequencies, the radio waves follow the Earth's curvature through a process called tropospheric ducting. The beam doesn't travel in a straight line into space. It bends slightly, following the horizon. This extends the range far beyond what line-of-sight propagation would allow. Professor Tizard interrupted. "Dr. Jones, tropospheric ducting is a known phenomenon, but it's unreliable and unpredictable. It depends on weather conditions, temperature gradients, atmospheric pressure. You can't build a precision navigation system on something so variable." "That's true, sir, if you're trying to predict when ducting will occur. But the Germans don't need to predict it. They just need to measure it. If the ground stations continuously monitor the beam's actual propagation characteristics and make real-time adjustments, they can maintain precision regardless of atmospheric conditions." Another voice chimed in, more hostile. "This is speculation piled on speculation. You're assuming capabilities we have no evidence the Germans possess." Jones had prepared for this. Actually, sir, we do have evidence. 3 weeks ago, an RAF reconnaissance flight photographed a German installation near Hamburg. The photos show 3 large antenna towers arranged in a precise geometric pattern. At the time, our interpreters dismissed them as a broadcasting station. But look at the spacing. He produced the photographs and pointed to measurements. The towers are spaced exactly 14 meters apart. That's precisely the spacing you would use for a directional antenna array operating at 30 megahertz. The spacing is determined by the wavelength. This isn't a coincidence. This is an antenna specifically designed to create a focused radio beam at the exact frequency mentioned in the intercept. The room was silent now, paying attention. Jones pressed his advantage. There's more. We've interrogated several German pilots who were shot down during the Polish campaign. Most refused to talk, but one pilot, when pressed about navigation systems, said something odd. He said German bomber crews no longer worried about getting lost because they could hear their way to targets. At the time, interrogators thought he meant radio compass navigation. But what if he meant something more literal? What if he meant they could hear a signal that guided them directly to their targets? Air Chief Marshal Dowding leaned forward. Dr. Jones, if what you're saying is true, why haven't we detected these beams? We have radio monitoring stations all over Britain. Surely we would have noticed German radio transmissions powerful enough to do what you're describing. We haven't been looking for them, sir. Our monitoring stations are focused on communications traffic, Morse code, voice transmissions. These beams would sound different. They would be continuous tones, easily mistaken for atmospheric noise or interference. Unless you knew specifically what to listen for, you'd ignore them. Then how do we know they exist at all? Jones took a breath. This was the moment everything depended on. We don't know for certain, sir. Not yet. That's why I'm here. I need resources to search for these beams. I need aircraft equipped with sensitive radio receivers to fly search patterns over Britain, listening for German transmissions at specific frequencies. I need technical specialists to analyze any signals we find. And I need permission to develop countermeasures because, gentlemen, if I'm right, these beams are already operational. The Germans could use them tonight. The room erupted in debate. Half the people present thought Jones was chasing phantoms, wasting time and resources on theoretical speculation. The other half were deeply worried that he might be right. Then Churchill spoke for the first time. Dr. Jones, his voice cut through the argument. I have one question for you. Are you certain enough of this analysis that you would bet your career on it? Jones turned to face the man who would soon become Prime Minister. Mr. Churchill, I would bet far more than my career. I would bet the lives of every person in Britain, because that's exactly what we're betting if I'm right, and we do nothing. Churchill stood. Decision made. Give him his resources. If Dr. Jones is wrong, we'll have wasted some time and petrol. If he's right, we may be able to stop the most dangerous weapon Germany possesses. Air Marshal Dowding, make it happen immediately. Dowding nodded slowly. Very well, Dr. Jones, you have 3 days to find these beams if they exist. After that, if you've found nothing, this entire matter is closed. Is that clear? Perfectly clear, sir. 3 days. That's all I need. As the meeting broke up, Lindemann approached Jones. Congratulations, Dr. Jones. You've just bet everything on being right. I hope you are, because if you're wrong, your career in intelligence is over before it really began. Jones gathered his papers with trembling hands. He'd gotten what he asked for. Now he had to prove he wasn't insane. He had 72 hours to find an invisible weapon that half the government was convinced didn't exist. The clock was ticking. Within 6 hours of the meeting, Jones had assembled a team. It wasn't the team he wanted. Most of the specialists he requested were unavailable or assigned to other projects. But it was a team. His core group consisted of Charles Frank, a young physicist who'd been working on radar development and who understood radio theory; Frederick Winterbotham, an intelligence officer who knew German military procedures; and Derek Jackson, an experimental physicist with experience in radio detection equipment. They were joined by 3 RAF radio operators who would fly in the search aircraft, and 2 technicians from the BBC's engineering department who understood radio propagation better than anyone in Britain. Their workspace was a converted storage room in the Air Ministry basement. Jones had secured access to 3 RAF aircraft, modified with special radio, receiving equipment, receivers that could scan across the frequency spectrum, and that were sensitive enough to pick up signals from hundreds of miles away. The plan was simple in concept but daunting in execution. The aircraft would fly systematic search patterns over England and Scotland, scanning radio frequencies between 20 and 40 megahertz, the range where Jones calculated German beam transmitters would most likely operate. If they detected strong directional signals originating from Germany, especially signals that formed narrow beams rather than omnidirectional broadcasts, that would be evidence the beams existed. But there were enormous challenges. The radio spectrum was crowded with signals. Broadcasting stations, military communications, natural atmospheric noise, interference from electrical equipment, all of it created a chaos of radio energy that would be difficult to sort through. Finding a specific German beam in that chaos would be like finding one particular star in a sky blazing with millions of stars. Moreover, German beam transmitters might not be active at all times. If they were only turned on for actual bombing operations, and if Germany wasn't currently conducting night raids on Britain, the beams might simply not be there to detect. Jones had one advantage. He knew approximately what he was looking for. Based on his analysis of the intercept, he expected German beams to have specific characteristics. They would be continuous tones, not modulated Morse code or voice. They would be extremely directional, strong in one direction, and weak or absent in others. And they would likely be on frequencies between 30 and 33 megahertz, based on the specifications mentioned in the intercept. On the evening of September 5th, the first search aircraft took off. Jones stood in the operations room, listening to the radio chatter from the crew, watching the plotted course on a map, feeling the weight of his 72-hour deadline pressing down on him. The aircraft flew a north-south pattern along the east coast of England, its receivers scanning continuously. For the first 2 hours, the crew reported nothing but normal radio traffic and atmospheric noise. Jones felt his stomach tightening. What if he was wrong? What if the entire beam theory was just an elaborate misinterpretation of a German technical discussion? Then, at 9:47 p.m., the radio crackled to life. Control, this is Search 1. We're picking up something odd. It's a continuous tone, very steady, approximately 31.5 megahertz. Signal strength is increasing as we fly north. It seems to be coming from the east, from the direction of Germany. Jones grabbed the microphone. Search 1, this is Jones. Can you characterize the signal? Is it directional? There was a pause as the crew checked their equipment. Then, affirmative. Signal is highly directional. When we turn the aircraft, the signal strength changes dramatically. It's like we're flying through a narrow beam of radio energy. Jones felt his pulse racing. Search 1, I need you to map that beam. Fly a course that keeps the signal at maximum strength. Then fly across it and map where it gets stronger and weaker. I need to know how wide it is and where it's pointing. For the next hour, the aircraft methodically mapped the signal. What they found was exactly what Jones had predicted. A narrow radio beam, no more than a few degrees wide, emanating from somewhere in Germany and passing across England in a precise line. When the crew plotted the beam's direction on a map, they found it pointed directly at an industrial complex in the Midlands. By midnight, the second aircraft had found another beam on a slightly different frequency, this one pointing toward a shipyard on the Thames. The third aircraft found a third beam aimed at an RAF airfield in Scotland. The beams were real. They existed. Jones had been right, but being right brought no satisfaction, only cold terror. Because if the beams were already active, already pointed at specific targets, that meant German attack plans were probably already in motion. Jones called an emergency meeting for 6 a.m. the next morning. He needed to brief the air staff immediately. Britain was more vulnerable than anyone had realized, and time was running out. As his team worked through the night analyzing the beam data, Jones sat alone for a moment, staring at the maps showing where the beams pointed. 3 beams, 3 targets, all critical to Britain's war effort. The Germans had apparently been running their beam transmitters regularly, probably for testing or training, confident that the British would never detect them or understand what they were. That confidence was about to be shattered. But the question was, what could Britain actually do about it? Finding the beams was one thing. Stopping them was something else entirely. To understand how Britain would counter the German beams, we must first understand how they were created. And for that, we must travel to Germany in 1938, to the Lorenz Company's research facility in Berlin, where a team of engineers was solving a problem that would reshape the war. The Lorenz Company was one of Germany's premier electronics manufacturers, known primarily for blind landing systems that helped aircraft land in fog or darkness. The technology was elegant. Radio transmitters on either side of a runway sent out overlapping beams. If a pilot heard Morse code dots in his headphones, he was left of the runway. If he heard dashes, he was right of the runway. But if he heard a continuous tone, he was perfectly aligned. By following the tone, a pilot could land safely without ever seeing the ground. In 1938, a Lorenz engineer named Johannes Plendl had a revolutionary idea. What if this same technology could be scaled up and used not for landing aircraft, but for guiding them to targets hundreds of miles away? The technical challenges were immense. A blind landing system only needed to work over a few miles at most. Creating beams that could guide bombers from Germany to targets in Britain meant ranges of 300 miles or more. The radio signals would have to be extraordinarily powerful. The beams would have to be narrow enough to provide precision guidance, and the entire system would have to be reliable enough for combat operations. Plendl assembled a team and began experimenting. They built prototype transmitters and tested them at increasingly long ranges. They discovered that by using specific frequencies and by carefully designing their antenna arrays, they could create beams that were much narrower and more stable than anyone thought possible. The breakthrough came in early 1939 when they successfully guided a test aircraft from Berlin to Munich using only radio beams, in complete darkness, through cloud cover. The aircraft's navigator followed the beam using equipment that was essentially a modified Lorenz blind landing receiver. When the aircraft crossed a second beam that intersected the first, the navigator knew he was over the target. The bombing error was less than 200 meters. The military implications were obvious. Germany had been preparing for war for years. The Luftwaffe had built a powerful bomber force, but like all air forces of the era, it was limited by navigation problems. Bombers could strike targets effectively in daylight when landmarks were visible, but night bombing was largely a matter of guesswork and luck. Cities could be hit. They were big targets. But specific factories, railway yards, military installations were nearly impossible to locate and strike at night. The Lorenz beam system changed everything. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe could strike any target, any time, with precision that rivaled daylight bombing. And at night, German bombers would be much safer from British fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The German military, usually skeptical of new technology, embraced the system immediately. They gave it the codename Knickebein, crooked leg, after the distinctive bent antenna towers used for the transmitters. By the time war began in September 1939, 5 Knickebein transmitters were operational, covering most of Britain. German bomber crews were being trained in its use, and it was integrated into operational planning at the highest levels. The Germans were so confident in their technological advantage that they didn't take elaborate security precautions. Knickebein was mentioned in radio transmissions using normal military encryption. Bomber crews were allowed to discuss it generally, though they were cautioned not to reveal details to outsiders. The antenna towers were visible and could be photographed by reconnaissance aircraft. The Germans simply didn't believe the British were capable of detecting or understanding the system. Germany's radio technology had been more advanced than Britain's throughout the 1930s. The frequencies Knickebein used were unfamiliar to most British radio engineers. The concept of using radio beams for navigation was novel, and even if the British did detect the beams, the Germans assumed it would take months or years to develop effective countermeasures. This was the strategic miscalculation that would prove catastrophic. The Germans had created a revolutionary weapon, but they had underestimated their enemy's ability to respond. They didn't know about Dr. Reginald Jones. They didn't know that Britain's intelligence services had already intercepted discussions of Knickebein. And they certainly didn't know that within weeks of war starting, the British would not only detect their precious beams, but begin developing ways to defeat them. In late September 1939, as Jones was proving the beams existed, German bomber crews were conducting final training exercises, preparing for the campaign that would bring Britain to its knees. They flew at night, following the beams, dropping practice bombs with remarkable accuracy. Their confidence was absolute. Many believed the war would be over by Christmas. They had no idea that their most powerful weapon had already been discovered, and that the invisible war was about to begin. Understanding how Knickebein worked requires understanding the physics of radio waves, and more specifically, how those waves could be shaped and directed with precision. Radio waves are electromagnetic radiation, essentially the same phenomenon as light, but with much longer wavelengths. A radio wave at 30 megahertz, the frequency used by Knickebein, has a wavelength of about 10 meters. This is crucial because the wavelength determines how the wave interacts with antennas and with the environment. The Germans used a technique called phased array transmission. Imagine 3 antenna towers arranged in a precise geometric pattern. Each tower transmits the same signal, but the signals are carefully timed so they're slightly out of phase with each other. In most directions, the signals interfere destructively and cancel each other out. But in one specific direction, they combine constructively, creating a powerful, focused beam. This is similar to how multiple loudspeakers can be arranged to create directional sound. If you've ever stood in front of a line array speaker system at a concert, you've experienced the same principle. The sound is loud and clear directly in front of the speakers, but quickly drops off to the sides. Radio beams work the same way. The Lorenz engineers had refined this technology to an extraordinary degree. Their antenna arrays could create beams just 1 or 2 degrees wide at the transmitter, maintaining that focus for hundreds of miles. To put this in perspective, a 2-degree beam pointed at London from a transmitter in Germany would create a zone only about 6 miles wide over the target. Narrow, enough to distinguish between different parts of the city. But creating a narrow beam was only half the problem. The other half was encoding information into that beam, so bomber crews would know when they were precisely on course. This is where the Lorenz blind landing system's heritage became crucial. The beam was split into 2 overlapping sections, using a technique called equisignal navigation. The transmitter sent out Morse code, with dots on one side of the beam's center line and dashes on the other. But the dots and dashes were timed so they interlocked perfectly. When a bomber was exactly in the center of the beam, the dots and dashes overlapped completely, creating a continuous tone in the pilot's headphones. If the pilot heard more dots than dashes, he knew he was drifting left. More dashes meant drifting right. As long as he heard a continuous tone, he was flying exactly along the beam's center line, directly toward the target. The system was brilliant in its simplicity. It required no complex calculations by the crew. A pilot didn't need to understand radio theory or navigation mathematics. He just needed to keep the tone steady in his headphones. Anyone could learn it in a few hours. For precision targeting, the Germans added a refinement. They would set up a second transmitter that sent a beam across the first one, intersecting at the target. The bomber flew along the first beam until crossing the second, at which point the crew knew they were over the target and released their bombs. In practice, a typical Knickebein guided bombing mission worked like this. The bomber would take off from its base in Germany or occupied France. Once airborne, the radio operator would tune the receiver to the frequency of the appropriate Knickebein transmitter. He would listen for the beam signal and direct the pilot to fly toward it. When they intercepted the beam, they would hear either predominantly dots or predominantly dashes. The pilot would turn toward the continuous tone. Once established on the beam, flying became almost relaxed. The pilot simply maintained altitude and heading, keeping the tone steady. The navigator could focus on other tasks. The bomb aimer prepared his equipment. As they approached the target, the radio operator monitored a second frequency, listening for the crossing beam. When he heard it, he would give a warning. Beam crossing in 30 seconds. The bomb aimer would prepare. When the tone from the second beam reached maximum strength, indicating they were at the intersection point, the command came, "Bombs away." The entire process was systematic, repeatable, and accurate to within a few hundred meters, even in total darkness through heavy clouds. It was the precision bombing capability that every Air Force had dreamed of, and it was completely invisible to anyone on the ground. Unlike searchlights or even engine noise, which could warn a city that bombers were approaching, the radio beams gave no indication to civilians below. The first warning would be the sound of explosions as bombs found their targets with shocking accuracy. Jones understood all of this as he analyzed the beams his aircraft had detected. He understood the physics, he understood the engineering, and he understood that Britain was facing a threat unlike any in history. But he also understood something the Germans apparently did not. If you understood how the beams worked, you could defeat them. The same physics that made them powerful also made them vulnerable. The question was, how?